This session is entitled Lifting the Voices of Incarcerated Writers Through Collaboration and a Poetics of Abolition. The panel emerged as the description narrates through a class called Community Outreach for Creative Writers. It's a graduate class that all the participants in the panel, together with 7 other folks, worked on through the fall of 2021, together with an equal number of collaborators, I might say co-conspirators, thinking of conspiracy etymologically, right? To breathe with, right? Conspire, right? Breathing together. It's a great etymology to keep in mind. So I do think it's fair to say that we were co-conspiring with collaborations with incarcerated writers at Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility or prison, about 15 minutes down the road between Ypsi and Saline. Well, without further ado, I'll just introduce the panelists. They've done a terrific job of self-organizing this and kind of asking me to support the project, which I did wholeheartedly and enthusiastically after they had done all the hard work of bringing this panel together. So I will introduce Andy Pontiff, Parker Wilson, and Kelly Norman, who also goes by Kells. Gates Domeyer was also a participant in this panel, contributed to its organization, and will be present in absentia, together with the many folks whose voices we will hear by proxy, for the obvious reason that they are incarcerated. And it might be good to really voice their names with that awareness when their names do come up in the discussion, right? So without further ado, I'll pass this over to Kells.
Welcome everyone to our panel. We're all excited to be here, if not a little bit nervous. As Rob mentioned, each of us are enrolled in a creative writing master's program here at Eastern, and we all had the pleasure of taking his community outreach for creative writers course this past fall semester. And in this class, we engaged in a creative partnership and collaboration with the women at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility. Through this engagement, we shared and wrote poems with the women on the inside, and we also together examined problems and even our own relationship within and around the prison industrial complex. Most importantly, though, we worked to build solidarity with the women on the inside in a number of ways, and we're going to get into what that is a little bit later. But part of this included creating a collaborative anthology, which is still in progress. As you can imagine, there's lots of challenges that come with this engagement. This collaboration, as Rob mentioned, is going to be highlighted throughout our presentation as we read a couple of the poems through various means. And yeah, so a couple of the texts that we read in this class are going to be Jackie Wang's Carceral Capitalism, which we'll talk about, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Liat Ben-Moshe's Disepistemologies of Abolition. We also read Angela Davis, I believe it was, Is Our Prisons Obsolete? And we had the pleasure of screening a film called College Behind Bars, which I believe you still can find on Netflix at this time. I'm going to pass it to Andy to talk about some of the things we're going to cover.
Hi all, I'm Andy. So these are the kind of 4 major themes we wanted to discuss. There were so many themes we could pull out of this class. It was trying to figure out what we were actually going to talk about was one of the biggest challenges of this, because there's just so much we could cover, and there's so much we covered in the class. But we did pick out 4 major themes. So first being solidarity. The second is reformist reforms versus abolitionist reforms, which will take some time to explain. Third is a concept from Mark Nowak. It's called first person plural, so we'll get into that a little as well. And then lastly, we'll talk about the prison abolitionist imagination, which is a concept from Jackie Wang. So first of all, we wanted to define this term abolition. What do we mean by abolition? The more dictionary definition of abolition is the action or act of abolishing a system, practice, or institution. And when most people think of abolition, the thing that pops into your head is the abolition of slavery, which is one of sort of the biggest example of US cultural knowledge of this. But what we're specifically interested in is the abolition of the prison industrial system, or PIC, which is a term popularized by Angela Davis. So abolishing the PIC is more complex than simply closing all prisons, and requires a certain type of imagination and a letting go of certainty, a letting go of absolutism, which again, we'll get into a little more later. As abolitionists, we understand that the PIC spreads much farther into our lives than what is often thought or seen. Everyone has been impacted by it, whether directly or indirectly, and whether you realize it or not. Often the question about abolition comes first to replacement. At least that's what I thought when I first started the class. My immediate sort of go-to thought was, okay, if we don't have prisons, well, then what replaces it? What do we do instead? And I slowly learned, I think all of us learned, that we have to sort of unshackle our understanding of abolition with the idea of replacement. Anything that replaces the prison system would be just another recreation of it, which would end up solving nothing. All right, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so our first big theme is that of solidarity, and that theme sort of threaded itself through everything we did in the class. And this poem by my correspondent Nidra was one of the first poems we read together as a class, one of the first ones, if not the first one we were sent from our correspondents. And I think this poem is a really great way to start us off, because it really, I think, very cleverly and effectively gets to some of the like the heart of what solidarity meant for us in this class and what it means to us. And also, I think Nidra's voice is very present in this poem as well. So she will speak through me as I read it. So this is Solidarity by Nidra. Solidarity is of strength, like gorilla glue that contains the feeling of unity and cannot be broken, like cracked mirrors that does not show reflection and cause an abrasive reaction of divide and conquer. It's all so abstract. Does it mean 1 + 1 = 1? In resistance together like octane, an explosive new language will be born, lifting intuitive spirits to form a bond, interlocking our fingers as it leaves only our thumbs up. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Nidra, and I am a part of you all. So with that poem in our minds and our hearts, move on to why solidarity? What is solidarity? So like I said, it was how we started the class. We attempted to define it sort of beyond a dictionary definition. Solidarity means mutual support, unity, and agreement. But what did it mean to be in solidarity with a group like the writers at Women's Huron Valley? And most importantly, how could we create a relationship based around solidarity with our writing partners? So we quickly ran into some challenges, most of which revolved around the power dynamics of such a relationship. The conditions of the relationship were ever present and undeniable. The women there have a very strict schedule, and they have limited access to resources we tend to take for granted. Internet access, simply time to write poetry and letters. So we had to question our position and our approach. We didn't want to position ourselves as some sort of authority. And while we wanted to address and acknowledge the conditions of existence that these women are in, we didn't want that to be the sole focus of our exchanges with them either. What we discovered was it was sort of theoretically impossible to achieve a true solidarity or true equalness with women we corresponded with because of the conditions. We were always going to be in a position of power, but that didn't mean our efforts weren't worthwhile or that we couldn't achieve a sense of solidarity despite the limitations and power dynamics we faced. In fact, developing a relationship despite these challenges was integral to our learning and the learning of our writing partners. What it allowed us to do was simultaneously acknowledge and go beyond the conditions of the relationship to create an imaginative space that allowed us to recenter ourselves within the space of abolition and imagine what a world without a prison could look like. Solidarity for us had to be about creating conditions of transformation across these radical differences, not identification with someone else's suffering, but about recognizing that we are all part of the same social system that creates suffering. So, and with that, I think I will move it on to, is it Parker or Kel's next?
That is me. Thanks, Andy. I just want to say a quick thanks to Kels and Gates as well for helping put this whole thing together. Everyone's putting some great work. And a quick thanks also to Rob for introducing us to the whole abolition world. I want to talk about reform approaches to the prison problem, to the carceral state versus our own abolitionist approaches. So when we talk about reform, we're really talking about something that is taking kind of existing structures, existing forms, existing pieces of what we already have and trying to make it better. And those approaches often failing simply because we're using the existing orders to reformulate something and just kind of taking a new shape. And I'll provide a couple examples of it, but we abolitionists don't like that because we are looking for a solution to this problem that is more detached from the current systems, and it is certainly difficult to kind of assimilate what this world will look like, this abolitionist world will look like when we compare it to what we already have. So I think that's also where a Poetics of Abolition can come into play, because a poetics can use our imaginations, can kind of delve into these different areas of thought, so we can imagine something other than what we already have. So I start out with this quote by Ben Moshe that Kels mentioned earlier, and I have abolition can be thought of as letting go of attachments to forms of knowledge that rely on certainty. And that comes from Ben Moshe's work on disepistemology. And disepistemology is just a way of kind of unknowing what we already know. Epistemology, knowing dis, so unknowing something. And we can also connect this kind of unknowing to, what we take for granted, what we take as common sense. So I think a major common sense theme within this whole abolitionist project is that we need prisons, right? A lot of people just assume that we need them, and we want to challenge that. And I think when I have this conversation with people, a lot of the time they agree with reform, but getting rid of prisons just seems ludicrous. It seems ridiculous, right? How can we possibly have a world without prisons? So I think one way of kind of challenging this common sense and challenging the prison structure, the carceral state, is to look at the history of it. So I just want to bring up the 13th Amendment real quick. There's been a lot of great work done on this, and there's some great documentaries and books out there that you could read. But what's interesting about the 13th Amendment is its particular language. So I'm just going to read a section of it real quick. It's neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to this jurisdiction. So the part we want to focus on is except as a punishment for crime. So, after slavery was abolished, kind of what happened in the South was former enslaved people were largely found guilty of crimes, which could often be like vagrancy. And this is where our modern prison system kind of started, was kind of a reaction to the abolition of slavery. So that's like kind of where its roots are, and that's why we see this carceral state in the prison industrial complex being such a racist complex as well. Why African Americans are imprisoned at highly disproportionate rates. So I think when we look at this history, we can kind of understand why we have this prison system and the problems we have with it, and why we as abolitionists look at it and want to change it. So then I'm going to move on to my other quote here. Alternatives cannot come from living in the existing order, but from a process of change that will come as a result of a transition from it. And that's also Ben Moshe. So this is just kind of reinforcing the problem with reform, that existing order, and connecting it and offering that abolition as an alternative to that, that we're transitioning away from just this whole structure that exists. So can we move on to the next slide, please? Thank you, Andy. And I just include this real quick just to show a quick example of kind of how extreme and radically we've imprisoned people over the years. Obviously, you can see this this exponential increase, and I just included this to show that often it just happens to be the case that we build prisons and we create prisoners. I don't think we're building prisons to match necessarily a higher level of crime. A lot of time we build prisons because maybe we say the prisons are overcrowded, and this is like an example of reform. And when the prisons are built, we simply fill them. So as far as reform goes, building new prisons is never an answer. It's just increasing the carceral state all around. If we move on to the next slide, please. All right, so I love this graph. And if you look at this graph on your own, there are a lot more examples, and you can, and they have this graph not only for like decarceration, but also like for decreasing the amount of police officers in society and so on. But this is just a small slice of it. And it's great because basically what it's saying is, does building jails or prisons address the overcrowding of rising numbers of new prisons? And this graph is showing, no, it's not. And then below, reducing the number of people in prisons and jails is a great form of decarceration. And as abolitionists, that is one thing we certainly do want. And then we can move on to the next slide. So one problem we kind of run into with decarceration can be a kind of like a give and take. We might try to solve one problem and it just creates more problems somewhere else. So I have this quote from Jackie Wang here. It is important to note that a decrease in the total number of people incarcerated does not necessarily mean that our society on the whole is becoming a less carceral one. So, as abolitionists, we do want decarceration, of course. We want less people in prisons, we want less prisons overall. But when we start to implement that, and we see that maybe, and this is Wang's point, is when we possibly reduce, say we reduce the number of like low-level offenders in prison. So as the war on drugs loses legitimacy, less people are in prison for those low-level offenses, and we think, great, we're starting to decarcerate. But what actually happened was people with higher level offenses were receiving longer sentences. So we weren't necessarily decarcerating the whole system. It was just a shift of carceration. So I think my point here is just that decarceration in itself isn't necessarily going to move us away from the carceral state. We need to look at it in a bigger picture and understand that moving one piece around is just a very small tile in a much larger mosaic, and we need to be careful about every piece of that puzzle. You know, just looking at prisons themselves doesn't give us a picture of like the whole carceral state, right? Because there's these surveillance technologies of people outside of prisons. So if you don't send someone to prison, but you're surveilling them outside of that prison, that's still a form of the carceral state, and that's obviously something we don't want. So what is the connection between prison abolition and a poetics abolition? And I'm about to move into my own relationship with Tracy Lee, who's an incarcerated woman at WHV. But the Poetics of Abolition, as far as I understand it, is using language to envision this space that is moving away from the carceral state. And that can mean something as simple as, you know, not using cliches, and moving away from what our common sense is, because this whole structure, the carceral state, the prison industrial complex, these things aren't just isolated events, right? The language we use and the way we act, they're all kind of connected. So when we start to break down what we know, what we think we know, and start thinking of it differently, then we can formulate that within a poetics of abolition. And it's not just an art form. I think it has a lot more power than that. Because, you know, these women in WHB that are able to write about their own situation, or just use language to envision different spaces, this is creating awareness for them, and this can have real change. And I would liken that as well to workshops, maybe like in inner city areas, where, you know, kids who otherwise might not understand like the bigger picture of the world that they're in, through poetry can begin to understand that, and realize their own situation within this like larger picture. So now I'm going to read a poem by Tracy Lee. So this is Pithy by Tracy Lee. War of any nature becomes languidness. Tatters of regard mold profuse collaboration, either taken to the streets to be handled in numerous trends or delicately orchestrated by legitimate counsel. Forces incorrectly directed must be shepherded into productivity. Variation expected, required to a certain steady, rhythmic change, one rodeo at a time. A grasp to resolve a dire urgency to reconstruct solidarity, fervor in order for humanity's existentialism. Turbulently, we wrestle the essential giant until compromise creates a throng of allies decisive to lasso and hogtie the bucking undertaking that must be completed. Narrow is the road, few find it. So I love this poem. I especially love the last line, but I think one thing that Tracy Lee is doing here is using language in a way that disrupts these common senses that we have, and moves away from cliche. So, you know, by kind of formulating these new structures with her words, she is making an abolitionist move. And yeah, so I think we're gonna move on to Gates Stillmeyer right now. And Kelsey's gonna play some recordings from her.
Yeah, before I do that, actually, or actually Andy does that, I wanted to touch on something that you reminded me of, Parker, um, in reference to the exponential increase in prisons in the US, specifically, and our response to quote unquote crime or other issues, being that people create more prisons. Our class, like I mentioned before, had the pleasure of going to or watching a screening of a film called College Behind Bars, which highlights the Bard Prison Project, or the Bard College. Bard? Oh my gosh, I can't remember the name.
I think it's Bard College Prison Initiative.
Okay, thank you. Which is in New York. And one of us had asked a question to some of the folks involved in the administration of this initiative, saying, hey, we've noticed, or at least the film highlights, that the men's prisons, something Angela Davis talks about as well, men's prisons tend to get more resources, maybe textbooks or number of people who are enrolled into the Bard College, compared to women's prisons. Like, what's going on with that? Like, how are you guys addressing this inequity, this inequality? And interestingly, the response from the administration, and it came from a person who was really, really excited to tell us this. She had said, yes, we've noticed this trend, and we are going to be building another prison in upstate New York, to another women's prison. And their thinking was that, oh, well, one of the reasons the men's prisons get more resources is because there are more men there, because there's a higher percentage of people we can enroll. So the idea was then to increase the number of women in prison, rather than simply may not be the right word here, addressing the inequality in and of itself. So a response to inequality was, let's just increase the number of women we have inside of a prison, which was just a really interesting and real time consequence we see of our carceral state. I just wanted to bring that up. I don't know, Andy, Parker, you had a comment on that?
Well, I think it's just fascinating that people involved in these reform works or these abolitionist works can still have those kind of ideas, and that just goes to show like how strongly ingrained that is in everyone's mind. That like something like increasing prisons can help.
Okay, so we're going to share a recording of something that Gates has wonderfully contributed to our presentation. And she's going to be talking about the first person plural, which is a concept that was developed and introduced in a book we read called Social Poetics by Mark Nowak. I'm going to play a recording of her words first. Then we'll talk about this a little bit, and then she's going to read another poem for us all.
Mark Nowak's Social Poetics offers an innovative way to think and practice the relation between poetry and social action, as it strengthens the connective tissue between hearts, words, and resistance. People's histories are made from the language of struggle that people share, which is fortified by the solidarity of collaborating and writing together, just like our work with the Women Huron Valley Correctional Facility. Nowak introduces the first person plural. The plural collective embraces, augments, and amplifies our imaginings in ways that are impossible for the singular. Embedding human existence with the social, genre is on the side of the collective and social. Furthermore, collectively composed poems enact a love pedagogy and radical consonance between singular and plural collective and first person plural. Mark Nowak states in his book, they engage in an imaginative militancy as new narrators create narrative about working class lives, all in the new vocabulary of our times. Personally, I was particularly moved by the fostering of communities of poetry and the camaraderie nourished by composing together. More specifically, social poetics emphasizes the hardships of the human condition in all facets of life: capitalism, trauma, abolition, etc. Perhaps this is what grants poetry its universal language, its ability to connect human beings through experiences that might otherwise be seen as separate.
I want to hang on that last line for just a second. Connecting us together, connecting lives together that might otherwise seem separate. When we talk about solidarity and ways to achieve solidarity, one thing that's really important is that in no way are we erasing or ignoring the differences that we have with one another. Rather, we're creating a space for transformation, and we're creating spaces where we can recognize the walls that separate us also in some ways bind us. The things that make us different can also in other ways connect us. And how can we unite in our struggle while recognizing these differences? This is a quote on the first page, on the first page of this chapter from Mark Nowak, which gives a sense of how, at least in poetry and in our discourse, we can think about solidarity and think about including others and not just thinking about our own bubble in our struggles. He writes, "Pronouns pose and enclose possibilities. Us broadens the world of me. We open spaces of solidarity for I, and they broadens the binary. The plural is a collective with an innate potential to embrace, augment, and amplify our imaginings in ways impossible for the singular." One of the other ways that we are achieving some solidarity is through share. I'm so sorry, my cat's going crazy. Through sharing these poems, and later on, we're going to share some recordings from folks who are still incarcerated and some folks who are formerly incarcerated. But the thought there is in saying it's not just my voice that matters. We really are trying to elevate and lift up the voice of other folks, and give them a space where you can hear them, even though they're not physically here or digitally here, and give them that opportunity. Andy, Parker, do you have anything to add on to this before we share the poem?
I think you summed that up beautifully. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Okay. So Gates is going to read this poem here by Tamara. It's called Fragment. I'm just going to go ahead and let her voice take the stage.
Fragment by Tamara. An aroma escapes my heart as I'm crushed. Granny Smith apples drowned in cinnamon with golden butter crust. Hot fresh out the oven, quickly sliced, steam rise. Just as the heat from my body as tears are withheld from my eyes. Suffering from a broken heart, shattered in pieces, body, mind in shock, illumined by black light, fluorescent, appearing purple, royalty at sight. Let go of what you had in mind, disenchanted, appearing loaded with life's tools, but opening the chest, there is a raid seeping into a universal black hole. You buffer to make sense of it while you're in it. Life's force at a drizzle, collapsed crater, inertia, can't dredge a way out. The care has rot, nothing to substantiate a rise. Mental filaments, yet darkness fills my eyes. Unmet expectations of what eternal devotion would be. Perplexed, perquisite, of the friendship, verbosity, unagreed contingencies, baffling. Mythological conceit, contemptible, relentless, amassing my heart by the piece. Fragmentation, nevertheless, I am whole.
Okay, so just kind of let that poem sit with you for a minute. So one of the other topics that or books that we read in this class was Carceral Capitalism by Jackie Wing. Really incredible book. And I'm gonna cover two portions of this text. In this text, Jackie Wing takes us through the contemporary continuum of modern incarceration. She analyzes what we would call predatory government and policing practices, the political economy of fees, fines, and debt accrual. She looks at things like algorithms and automation with our ever increasing technology and how that plays into policing and legislation. All of these things contribute to the prison industrial complex, or what she would call our carceral state, our tendency to create punitive measures and to put people in prisons. I'm going to read a quote from the book. It's actually on the screen here. She writes, "When government bodies are strapped for cash, they can raise revenue by implementing software that automates the processes of finding people via ticketing, garnishing wages, social security, and tax returns, finding people, and extracting wealth, all while avoiding the cost of actually hiring personnel to individually file cases against people." This is a point I want us all to think about for just a moment. Our government, our society has a number of punitive measures in place without the need for any human interaction. And the question to really think about here is, how much easier does it thus become to punish people if we do not need to be involved in the first place? An example of automation that Ms. Wing brings up is traffic tickets for violations such as maybe speeding or running a red light. The practice in itself seems pretty sensible and benign, but it can easily become a nightmare for somebody who, say, has moved from their listed address. Maybe they don't receive the ticket and they get extra fines for late fees, and in some cases, a warrant out for their arrest placed on them. The fees for one traffic ticket easily become tripled, doubled, quadrupled in these circumstances, which goes back to what Wing would call parasitic practices of fining and increasing debt. Now, she explores several other examples of parasitic practices in her book, but the idea here is really that society and the government are creating punitive systems which lead to higher risks of incarceration, especially for minority populations. Inability to pay some things can lead to incarceration, whether for short or long periods of time. If you look at the research, you'll see that prisons in general, while they do have a mission stating that the goal is to rehabilitate incarcerated people, that's really not often the case. One thing to think about is through government funding, the more bodies that you have in prison and the longer that they're inside overall, the more money the prison and the state can generate. And that's the point of all these measures, whether it's ticketing or putting people behind bars, it's generating money. That kind of gets to the title of her book, which is Carceral Capitalism. I want to take a moment to highlight an example of one prison's lack of rehabilitative practices. And to do that, I'm going to share a commentary directly from someone who is incarcerated. This is called a commentary. You can find it on prisonradio.org, an organization which works really hard to elevate and share the voices and stories of folks inside. This is from the Women's Huron Valley, but there are several commentaries from folks all around the country, and it's a really, really great resource. And the whole transcript is right here on the screen if you would like to read along with it.
My name is Ashley Smith, and my number is 698-500. And I've wanted to call for quite a while, actually, but I've been apprehensive because I was worried about retaliation from the staff here. But I decided to call anyways and air what is going on here. There's only like enough programming here for 10 to 15% of the population, and they refuse to do anything about it. They continuously keep us here past out dates or just make us do all this dead time before we're ever able to do anything to actually do something productive towards rehabilitation, towards being an effective member in a community after we get out of here. I've been locked up since 2008. And I just got into college a year ago. I had to sit for 11 years before I could do anything. I've gotten no programming that was required of me when I came into prison. They asked for them to do 3 things. I haven't gotten to any of those things. Every day, people are getting flopped on their parole because they haven't done 1 or 2 classes that were required of them because this facility just doesn't do it. They plain flat out just don't put people in the classes that the parole board is requiring for them to get a parole. And since the men's facilities do it, the parole board has no understanding why none of the women that they see don't have their requirements met. And it's just, nobody knows about it because it's like a silently kept secret, and it's just not fair. They're using COVID as an excuse now, and COVID has been around for 2 years, and it's ridiculous. And they just are keeping us here longer than they need to, and nothing good is being done.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
So one that highlights, well, this one commentary, this 2-minute commentary highlights quite a few things going on in this one prison in our huge country. Again, she talks a little bit about some of the inequity and inequalities between men and women's prison, lack of resources, lack of programming, which for us can be a little bit ambiguous, but the programming can range from workshops that we hold through, such as with this class and other means for poetry and writing. It could also very well be college classes or a GED program. And yeah, so, and another thing is the threat of retaliation. While we are working here, or we worked with women, we also, I think Andy touched on this a little bit, had the obstacle of not really knowing what was going on behind those prison walls at any time. We wrote letters each week to our collaborators and correspondents, and some of us didn't get letters back, and we don't know why. We may not ever know why. So it's a bit of a mystery, but part of that is really thinking back to the power dynamic between staff and ourselves, and always just kind of being mindful of what's going on. Any other comments on that real quick? No? Okay.
I did want to add something real quick,
Yeah.
if I could, Kels.
Sure.
It just reminded me of a punitive measure that WHV was using against the women that we were in contact with. I think if they didn't do their homework, then they weren't allowed to send their letters to us. And I think we don't even have contact right now. I think that was the case a little bit ago. I'm not sure exactly right now, but these like avenues of communication with us, the outside world, are treated as is treated as like I can't find the word I'm looking for, but that's something that the women aren't necessarily granted. So they use that as like a form of oppression against the women. And like the educational programs that Eastern does with them and that are done a lot of places have been shown to reduce these reincarceration rates. So when you're limiting the access to the education and access to people outside the prison, you're reducing you're going to increase those reincarceration rates, and it's just furthering like that oppressive system. So like there's plenty of examples of this going on in the prisons where these tactics are used just to keep the people in prison down even more than they already are, and it's the opposite of rehabilitation.
Just a heads up that we're less than 10 minutes, and it would be great to have a few minutes for questions. So, and I know you have one more recording to share, and then we can get back to some of these issues in conversation.
Okay. Shoot. Okay. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to quickly go through this. I'm not going to read the quote. But one of the other things that we talked about in this class was the role of imagination. As Parker mentioned, the role of poetry and poetics and why we kind of do these things in the first place. But imagination is absolutely essential because, after all, a key component of abolition is to, quote, imagine new possibilities. Calling back to a prior slide, attending to abolition with prescriptive ideas of reform can be helpful, but also rather dangerous. This is where disepistemology comes in. We have to let go of what we already know to get somewhere new, because we don't know what the future is going to look like, and that's okay. Part of the process in abolishing the prison industrial complex and part of the process in engaging with these collaboration is going to be asking ourselves some uncomfortable questions and saying, okay, how have I personally contributed to this problem? What can I do on my personal individual front? And that's a really tough question. But imagination encourages and allows somebody to sit in that discomfort, to need through those questions, and to move towards some answers that may have previously been undiscoverable. Imagination can come in the form of the poem that's on this slide, extracted from Jackie Wang's book. It can come in the form of the painting that's on the slide, or even in a more discursive nature, such as this presentation. But no matter what form it takes, imagination allows us to communicate complex problems in a variety of ways and expands our reach to people who may have different interests or even skill sets. I'm going to leave this passage particularly up on the screen because it asks some really important questions, I think, when analyzing the relationship between prisoner and the jailer. But let's go ahead and let's listen to the final recording. We have a recording from Carmen Valentine. She was previously incarcerated at WHV and was a part of the wonderful work and engagement that Robin Eastern, I believe, does at the prison.
Okay, the poem is titled Michaela, and it reads, I am not supposed to be this, bleached shell or even bone, yet these are my hands, waving, waving. I know at the bottom is such violence. The South still feels like home. In photographs, our bodies meet on granite ledges, but surface has no color at depths like this. All her knowing of me, all parts of my life. If I could make sense out of the way water forms around something, receives slow because I am the same as her. Even if our eyes are only daring the Mississippi, the threat of deadly flooding is real. Like this pen is real. White sheets are real. Mouthfuls of black blood, ships swallowed unto the seafloor, beneath ravens, thunderclouds, in white insomnia, You must feel, you must see that we've drowned. And so we ask you, are you sailors? Because if we had a name, it would be Ocean, and we would not try to understand.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Okay.
I've heard that poem a dozen times and it never ceases to move me.
Certainly one of our favorite pieces. I'm sharing a couple resources on the screen. I'm going to paste them in chat. But if you are at a place where you're like, hey, how can I get involved or how can I learn some more information? These are some really, really great resources. I believe. So the poem from Carmen, she has a whole conversation here, is from Rust Belt Radio. And I highly encourage you guys to listen to that.
Great, thank you, all of you. That was a remarkable presentation. We do have a few minutes, so if anyone feels so moved to engage in any way, be it by question or comment, you can simply voice up. There are not many of us here, or send something by way of chat. John.
That was an amazing presentation. I mean, you guys did a great job. Very emotional, if that was your goal, to not only elevate awareness, of the topics you were talking about, but to get your audience, emotionally engaged and complicit, perhaps. I love the idea of solidarity. I mean, the poetry you guys shared was amazing. That solidarity poem and the last poem that we just heard, I mean, speaks so much to what I'm kind of working on with Muriel Rukeyser right now, is this idea of unity that escapes the epistemological paradigm of the person who lives in the idea of their own autonomous sovereign self, right? And when this, metaphorically, when we talk about prisons, I mean, what these people, that while they're incarcerated, I think what they're talking about is, imprisoned in our own epistemology, this idea of separateness. And that is how I think the whole prison system can exist. An idea of forcing separation as opposed to the paradigm shift of we're all related and interconnected. Anyway, I'm blown away. So I'm going to stop. But thank you guys so much. Good to see you guys again as well.
John, it's good to see you.
Thank you, John.
Hey, John, good to see you.
I might mention, because it came up, the aftermath of our work. It was just at the end of December that the Omicron peaked, and it was at that point, as we were preparing to complete the anthology that we were collaboratively working on, that our channels of communication were completely shut down. And which is a really, really great illustration of how this kind of engagement is seen by prison staff as a privilege. And as such, it can easily be withheld. It seems to my mind that there's no reason why we could not have continued to exchange letters. There seems to my mind no reason why we could not have exchanged permission forms. We were simply waiting for permission by a number of the writers, just a pro forma acknowledgement that my work is going to be used in this or that context, just as not only a gesture of respect, but a real well, for the prison, it's a legal technicality, but for us, it's an ethical commitment to the women's involvement, that we're not going to be simply using their work without their full awareness. So we were waiting for really minor things that were suddenly withheld. So that continues to be unfortunate. I have not resumed communication with any of the women inside since the end of December, despite my weekly missives to our liaison, a staff person who has in many ways been very, very helpful for us, but is nonetheless a staff person who has an obligation first and foremost to the Michigan Department of Corrections and not to us. Anyway, that's just bringing up to speed. Of course, I have every hope that we will resume our collaborations together. I hope with folks who have participated in the class and elsewhere as the work is ongoing. I mean, for us, we're bound by semester systems. Of course, the folks inside are bound by other legal constraints. That's just a brief follow-up. So. Any parting words or comments, questions?
Well, I just want to say thank you guys for coming. I mean, the chance to continue this discourse and conversation is really important, I think, especially given our status or inability to communicate with our collaborators and correspondents, because it helps keep us abreast, I think, of this complex challenge.
Yeah,
So.
I should use this as an opportunity to tell you, Parker, Kels, and Andy, that you are no longer bound by the volunteer restraint. So when folks come into everyone in the class was working under the sign of a quote unquote volunteer. And as a volunteer for programming inside the Michigan Department of Corrections, you're essentially signing away your right to communicate with folks by any other means beyond the official, right? So that's to say that while all the grad students in our class were engaging with correspondence that would move by paper through myself to our liaison, and by our liaison to the individuals incarcerated and collaborating with us. We are not allowed to use the United States Postal Service. We are not allowed to use the telephone, and we are not allowed to use JPay, which is an extractive, terribly extractive means by which folks inside can communicate by email with folks outside. It's terribly expensive, but nevertheless, we were not permitted to make use of those means of communication, right? So the communication with volunteers is strictly monitored. You are not bound by that any longer, right? So that is to say, if you feel moved to reach out to your correspondents, you may do so by those means that have to this time been prohibited to you, right? And if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to hit me up, and I'll be more than happy to guide you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Okay. Did I hear someone about?
We just said thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, all the thanks and the gratitude.
Okay, thank you all for your participation. That was awesome, and as always, just incredibly moving to me to just be a part of your manner of organizing the work that we did and presenting that. And I feel very, very grateful and honored to be in this position to accompany. So thank you. Okay. And I think this is a recording, so this will be available somewhere, and we should let people know that. Okay.
Absolutely.
So, okay. For the time being, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.